It is impossible to deny that the massive growth and advancement of technology has been astounding. In many societies across the world, electronics permeate the daily lives of nearly every individual. From equipment such as refrigerators and microwaves to devices such as smartphones and computers, we can see how dependent much of modern civilization has become on electronics. However, what we generally don't see or even consider is what happens when we're done with our electronics. When they break or become outdated, we simply discard the cell phone, laptop, or other piece of equipment and move on with our lives. Unfortunately, the negative impacts of this growing source of waste are extensive and affect the greater environment as well as individual populations across the globe. Not surprisingly, this impact is felt disproportionately and unjustly by already marginalized communities. This e-waste has become one of the fastest growing areas of waste in both developed and developing countries. India, for example, is the 5th largest producer of e-waste, generating about 1.7 million tons each year. Adiola offers a commonly accepted definition of environmental justice as any undue imposition of environmental burdens on innocent bystanders or communities that are not parties to the activities generating such burdens. After a close examination of the current e-waste management system in India, it becomes clear that it is an environmental injustice through the various ways that different marginalized groups are negatively impacted by the current practices. In India, there is a lack of regulation within the e-waste recycling sector. Approximately 95% of the generated waste is handled informally. This allows for impoverished people to be disproportionately exposed to the variety of health issues associated with electronic waste and the recycling process, even though they are not the ones producing such extreme amounts of waste. Unfortunately, their economic prospects are so grim that these people are desperate to make money any way they can. Because there is no formal training or education for the men, women, and children working in this sector, they often are not even aware of the dangers of the work they do. In defending the current practice, it is often argued by manufacturers that the valuable materials contained in e-waste, such as gold and copper, allow for it to be considered a resource to people living in poverty who have no other means of making money. However, the products that constitute e-waste have yet to be designed in a way that allows these supposed resources to be recovered safely or efficiently. One common practice of retrieving the valuable components off of various e-waste materials includes placing it in open buckets of acid. The lack of regulations for this type of recycling leaves workers in a very dangerous position and completely exposed to acid and other chemicals. They do not have the proper gear, the proper equipment, nor the proper settings in which to perform this process in a safe way. Fire is also frequently used to burn off materials and expose copper wires or other valuable materials that can then be sold. Not only is such use of fire a dangerous practice in itself, but this excess material is also often hazardous, containing chemicals such as polyvinyl chloride, otherwise known as PVC. PVC is a known human carcinogen and can also cause such health issues as reproductive and developmental disorders, diabetes, and immune system disorders. In addition, many components of e-waste are made up of hazard materials such as heavy metals. Computer boards, as just one example, contain cadmium, mercury, and lead. Exposure to these chemicals can cause severe health problems ranging from various diseases to the failure of different organs. Poor people, and especially poor women and children, bear the brunt of current e-waste management practices. These people come from social groups with very little power. Thus, their struggle is easily overlooked by the people in positions to determine and change regulations, as those individuals are not directly exposed to hazards involved. Electronic waste management and the lack of formal regulation is an injustice that serves as an environmental problem in India as well. The inefficient way that this waste is currently being dealt with poses a widespread threat to everything from water sources, air quality, and crops. Numerous studies have taken samples from both the immediate recycling facilities and the surrounding environment and found that both contained high levels of hazardous chemicals. The acid and other chemicals used in the informal recycling process are often dumped into the ground or a water source near the recycling plant. This leads to major contamination. The lack of regulation creating safe places to dispose of these substances, along with a lack of worker knowledge about the negative effects of this practice, harms the environment in a number of ways. Soil can be made hazardous to crops, and groundwater sources can become contaminated and harmful to drink. The burning of hazardous materials also leads to major air pollution that can also affect an area far beyond the recycling plant. Many studies have highlighted the proximity of India's informal recycling plants to slum neighborhoods, and more specifically schools and playgrounds in poorer areas of the country. Children, an incredibly vulnerable portion of the population, are then exposed to high quantities of toxic materials in the ground they play on, the air they breathe, and the water they drink. This can affect their development at a number of stages and decimates the environment in the areas they call home. While wealthier people have the power to prevent e-waste recycling from occurring in the areas where they live, India's impoverished population has no such say. Ultimately, however, the greater environmental effects stemming from current practices will impact not just people in poverty, but the greater Indian population as pollution and contamination continues to spread. As this pollution of the environment expands, even the wealthiest citizens will feel the effects in their own health and the health of their surrounding environment. Crops across the country will falter, water sources will become inhospitable to organisms and unsafe to drink, and the air will become unclean and toxic to not just humans but other plants and animals as well. If not for the sake of the workers and marginalized peoples being harmed every day by e-waste, then for the sake of their own well-being, policymakers and people of power in India need to accept accountability and work to change the e-waste management system. The problem of e-waste in India is not, however, a hopeless one. There are a number of potential solutions that have been proposed and formulated by scholars in order to slow the growing buildup of this hazardous waste and work against the many negative effects it has on the people and environment of the region. Perhaps the most obvious of these solutions is the need for manufacturers of various electronic products to begin using alternatives to the heavy metals and hazardous materials currently making up much of the e-waste. This in itself would have a great impact on the health of the workers, the surrounding communities, and the environment, in assuring that no additional hazards are introduced through the e-waste recycling process. E-waste recycling also needs to move more heavily into the formal sector. This means that more formal e-waste recycling plants need to be created that have the proper resources to safely deal with these materials. Workers in these plants need to be provided a comprehensive training to understand the materials they are working with and the procedures to recycle it. The government then needs to more closely regulate this recycling so that the informal sector does not outcompete the formal recycling plants. As long as this work is left unregulated, marginalized populations will be subject to exploitation and exposure to any hazards associated with this process. Several organizations in India have already begun serious work to change the way that e-waste is managed in the country. Chintan, for example, is an NGO that links the formal and informal recycling sectors in training a workforce, made up mostly of women, to collect e-waste and store it until enough is compiled to send it to a formal recycling plant. A significant part of this training includes education on the individual and environmental hazards of e-waste, and the many toxic materials contained within it. This type of work is certainly a step in the right direction in ensuring that e-waste recycling is properly regulated and that workers are properly informed. Government actors do, however, still need to play their part in ensuring large-scale enforcement and expansion of regulations, and consumers, as contributors to the e-waste problem, need to be conscious of the ways they dispose of their electronics and ensure that they are putting pressure on government officials to maintain policies that protect their environment and the workers.